She opened a dumpster and found the billionaire's missing daughter inside. Maya Williams was used to seeing things people tried to hide: dirt behind manicured hedges, a forgotten shoe at the edge of a formal lawn, the kind of small human wreckage that slid out of a life of wealth like a pebble from a polished pocket. On that night, just after midnight, the thing she heard was smaller than a shoe, the faintest rasping whimper folded into the clatter of the estate's back alley. The Harper estate ran loud even when the mansion slept. Generators, the soft thud of the kitchen's refrigeration units, the distant echo of a staff party long over. Maya had been finishing her shift in the servants' quarters, hands still smelling of lemon oil and the day's detergent. She moved toward the sound with her apron half unbuttoned, keys in her pocket, her breath fogging the cold air. A damp smell, old lettuce and a sourness like damp wool, hit before she rounded the garbage bay. The dumpster lid was half open because the night cleaner had jammed it against the loading dock. When Maya peered in, the world narrowed to a small, shuddering bundle wrapped in a blanket that was both beautiful and stained, the kind of expensive cotton someone might buy in a spur of indulgence and never use properly. A fist, no bigger than the top of Maya's palm, flailed once. A sound like a frail bird escaped. Maya's hands went steady. She stepped up onto the narrow lip, climbed in with the agility that came from years of climbing poor fences and tall laundry racks, and reached down into the smell. The blanket was cold, soaked through at one corner, and the baby's skin was paper-thin under it. Her mouth was open in a small, oxygen-starved gasp. "Lord, have mercy," Maya whispered, more to steady her own voice than as a prayer at first. She wrapped the infant in the warmth of her jacket, pressing the child's tiny face to the curve of her neck, feeling the faint, miracle thread heartbeat. With a mouthful of practiced breath, she blew into the baby's lungs, then rubbed her back until something like a cough came, a sputtering whimper that slowly swelled into a cry. The sound would have been small in any other place. Behind the Harper kitchen, it became a siren. The generator hummed. A motion sensor flicked a pale light across a service door. Within minutes, shoes pounded on concrete. Voices, low and controlled, then suddenly edged with panic, cut through the night. A security guard grabbed Maya's arm before she could stand. "Step away," he said, but his voice was brittle. He already had his radio to his mouth. The next footsteps were heavier, and the flare of a flashlight painted the alley at hard white. They moved the baby from Maya's jacket like she was evidence. She could feel gloved hands take the child, the small head custodied away like something that belonged to the house more than to any human. Someone said the word missing.
Someone else cried out a name, Thomas, as if calling a man from sleep could conjure him from whatever long table at the far end of the estate he occupied. When Thomas Harper arrived, it was in a ripple of opulence and fury. He was a man who treated the world like an extended ledger. His anger had the sharp edges of a balance sheet. He stepped into the alley with a security detail behind him and a face that had learned to be every expression except surprise. He saw the baby. He saw Maya. His eyes narrowed in the way of someone scanning an anomaly on a screen. "She's ours," he said, flat as a headline. It was not a question. Around them, the staff had gathered, drawn by the disturbance. There were whispers that would later turn into a different sound, the hungry murmur of a world ready to boil over. No one asked Maya if she belonged to the scene. The story that had been brewing through the estate's drawing rooms, that a child had gone missing from the Harper residence, collapsed into a simple, brutal narrative. The maid who had found the baby must have taken her. Accusation tastes different in a man like Thomas Harper. It cut and commanded. He gestured, and a guard, one of the private security men, not the uniformed municipal police, shoved Maya's shoulder. Cameras flashed, the estate's internal cameras, the security phones someone always carried, the recording devices of the staff who already knew the right angle for a scandal. They moved quickly. Maya's protests were a practical thing. She said her name. She said she had found the baby. She said she had nursed and warmed the child. But words do not carry the same weight when a gilded authority has decided the truth. In the alleys behind the Harper kitchen, where no one had thought much about the world that wasn't theirs, Maya became a figure of suspicion. Her dark hair fell in her face as the guard cuffed her wrists with plastic ties. She wrapped a hand around the rim of the dumpster as if holding on to the only solid thing left in the room. They put her in a small shed at the edge of the property, a place designed to hold tools and the occasional trespasser. The door shut with a thud that sounded like a verdict. Outside, voices rose. Some were commanded, some were indignant, and some were the loud clicks of phones being held up like small accused and exposed torches. Someone whispered a name, Vanessa, an accusation carried on a hush. Vanessa Harper was Thomas's wife, cultured, precise, the kind of woman who trained staff into invisibility and taught them that anything they could not control was to be feared. Inside the shed, the muffled roar of the estate was a chorus of potential punishment. Maya held her own hands and thought of the baby's breath. She thought of Greta's face, the way her landlady's shoulders had stooped like a hinge that had weathered many storms.
She thought of the small, steady acts that kept her alive, wringing out towels, sweeping under the same table, smiling to a child who no longer looked her way. Above all, she thought, I pulled her out. They called the municipal police, and the narrative widened. The next morning, before sunrise, the story of the dumpster leaked beyond the hedgeline. It was quick. Overnight, someone at the estate's PR had already spun a version. A maid found with a child she did not belong to. The feeds, hungry as any animal, lapped it up. In the glow of screens, Maya's face, an unremarkable, tired face, became the picture of an accusation. The headlines asked cruel questions. Social feeds layered the worst suppositions like garish paper on a monument. By midday, the story had a weather system of its own, and Maya was at center of a storm she had not called. At the municipal precinct, the air smelled of disinfectant and impatience. Maya's hands were still raw from the night. There were splinters on her palms she hadn't noticed until the cuff left a ghost of red. She was not a stranger to being taken in by the police. It had happened in different lives, when a glance the wrong way could become probable cause. But the way this room cataloged her, by her name, by a place on a resume, by the house where she worked, made her feel small in a way that touched bone. Detective Claire Monroe watched her from across the table, notepad open but not yet full. Monroe was the kind of cop who had been a listener long before the badge was a costume. She had a patience that did not confuse suspicion with fact. I know it looks bad, Monroe said quietly, folding the paper back into herself to make space for truth. But what matters is what we can prove. Belief isn't evidence. Maya's voice came like a thread. I saved her, she said. I found her, and Her throat closed on the rest. Detective Monroe's eyes didn't move too fast. They held hers like a hand. Tell me everything, Miss Williams. Start at the beginning. Maya did. She told the way the night smelled, the way the blanket had been wrapped, the sequence of sounds that had brought her. She told them the rhythm of a child's breathing and how she'd warmed it with a jacket she had been meant to throw in the laundry. She told them the way Thomas's face looked, not surprised, but as if some plan had already been set in motion. Detective Monroe nodded at the small, important things, time references, precise details. We'll need to see the baby, she said, and the shed where you were held, and the dumpster. We'll need to see the footage. There was a pause that felt like a risk. This is high profile. There will be pressure from the family and from the papers. If you've kept anything, if you remember anyone you saw leaving, anything at all, you tell me. Maya thought of the blur of shoes, the suppressed conversations in the alley, the way a hand took the baby from her jacket. She thought of the smell of expensive fabric in the blanket, and the way it did not fit the trash around it. She said the first thing that came to her, I thought someone had thrown her out. Monroe made a small note, and then another. Okay, she said, we'll cross-check. If there's a gap in the security footage, that's something we can follow. At the estate, cameras hummed, but not all of them hummed the way they should. Within hours, it became clear that a segment of footage from the estate's main service camera was missing. The official excuse, that the feed had been overwritten, sounded like the thin sheet of a crowd control statement. For Maya, who had built a life by noticing what was omitted, it was a signature. People in her community are invisible by design, she thought. When something important disappears, they're the ones who are blamed. When she left the precinct, she had been fingerprinted, given a thin paper form that read like an apology in bureaucratic language. She was not yet charged with anything formal. Legal specifics, Detective Monroe cautioned, were indefinito to the narrative here and would depend on evidence. But the press would not wait for clarity. They painted her into shapes. A smear campaign circulated through the comment sections and daytime shows. A woman of color, a maid of low means, seen with a child who belonged to the richest household in the region. People stopped being people when they fit better as a picture. Maya was fired by message, a terse text from the Harper house manager that said, effective immediately. The work she had done for 10 years, sharp silver polish in the morning, careful bed making,
private grief carried for those who lived like gods, vanished into the same void as her security footage. She packed her few belongings into a plastic bag she had used for groceries and walked the short blocks to Greta's door. Greta's apartment smelled like old coffee and detergent. It was on the second floor of a building that had the bones of late marriages and early funerals, a place where people kept each other intact by mutual toleration. Greta, who had lived in the same unit for 20 years, opened the door with a face carved by worry but softened by immediate kindness. She wrapped Maya in an embrace that had no questions and carried the baby like she had known small things her whole life. "You're shaking," Greta said, her hand steadying Maya's elbow. She took the infant into her arms with the same certainty Maya had felt in the dumpster and cradled her under a soft kitchen lamp. "We'll get some clothes on her. We'll make her warm." Maya watched Greta move with a domestic serenity that felt like a shore after a storm. The baby made small, hungry noises and then slept, as if night had pulled a thin blanket over her. Greta brewed strong tea and leaned against the counter, watching the woman who had come into her house carry the infant who had been thrown away like rubbish. The world was loud outside.
Phones buzzed, news vans parked and idled like bad weather. A neighbor had recorded Maya's face on the night of the dumpster discovery and spread it like a rumor. Photos of the infant, still unnamed, catalogued briefly as the Harper baby, were sliced into feeds and opinions. A steady drum of outrage recommended itself from all vantage points, some calling for blood for the perceived theft, some attempting to defend the housekeeper who had become the public face of suspicion. "You did the right thing," Greta said, and it steadied Maya for a moment. Being told this did not make the camera stop. When the first major block of the story had aired, when the dumpster and the baby and the accusation had been sketched out in blunt strokes, a soft CTA hovered like something necessary to do. If this story is the kind that needs to be followed, that moment is the time for someone sitting in front of a flickering screen to decide whether they will watch the rest. If this is speaking to you, follow Maya's story. Subscribe to hear what comes next. After that, the months began to line up into work of investigation and the slow, bright labor of building a case out of what other people had discarded. Maya's name traveled through the precinct like a prayer and like a whisper. Detective Monroe believed her, but belief needed companionship from facts. "We need witnesses," she said. "We need footage. If anyone thinks they know something, they come to me." A man named Darnell had worked maintenance at the Harper property for years. He had the long, careful hands of someone who fixed expensive things, and the look of someone who had learned the estate's rhythms by watching the margins. He met Maya in the back of a laundromat, where dryers whirred like patient lungs. He kept his voice low. "I didn't speak up at first," he said, "because I thought I was just imagining it, but there's something you should see." He pulled out a thumb drive, the kind you could buy at a corner store for cash. Its casing was a little scuffed. He handed it to Detective Monroe first, who took it with the procedural stare of someone who had seen too many dead ends. After a preliminary check, Monroe told Maya and Greta to watch with their own eyes. The footage was shaky, it was late, dark. The motion-activated camera jittered. But there was movement, a figure crossing the service entrance at a time that did not fit the house's schedule. The silhouette carried something swaddled. The figure's shoulders were narrower than Maya's, the gait shorter and coated with a high heels rhythm. The person moved with an economy of motion that did not match the way Maya had climbed into the dumpster. For the first time since the alley's light had caught her, Maya felt the floor of the moment tilt. Darnell's eyes were fixed on the screen. "That camera usually archives everything," he said. "But this feed, someone made a copy. I found an extra. I kept it. It was, they all knew, a dangerous thing to have."
If the estate's official channels had overwritten the primary footage, a backup could become either salvation or a target. Darnell, who had kept his job because he preferred screws to power plays, had a look of someone carrying a secret that had acquired its own weight. The gardener, Otis, was a different kind of witness. He had known the Harper grounds since the time Thomas's children were small and ran in the grass like birds learning to fly. He had seen things a gardener sees: the footprints beside the hedgerow, the drag of a sleeve caught on a thorn, the cigarette butt that fell into a tray of pots. He had been reluctant to speak at first, the way people with long tenures at places of power sometimes are. But when an old man like Otis says he saw the service door open late, when he names the hour and mentions a smell, the faint scent of a particular perfume, detectives take notice. Otis described a woman in a long coat, the hem whispering against the ground, who had moved from the service entrance toward the alley at an odd hour. He named a time that did not match staff logs. He also confessed to overhearing a sharp conversation in the greenhouse 2 days earlier, an argument between someone he called Miss V and another staffer. It was the kind of detail that planted seeds. Camilla Rhee was a ghost in the Harper machine. She was Vanessa Harper's assistant, a woman whose job had been to smooth the sharp edges of an image and to stand at the ready with tea and rote sympathy. For weeks, she had been the person who kept Vanessa's schedule and removed uncomfortable facts from the perimeter of their lives. But conscience, Darnell would later say, is a soft thing that wears through the hardest leather. Camila had stayed in the background for days. Then, one evening, she walked into Greta's kitchen with hands that trembled and a small device that looked like a recorder. She placed it on the table as if it had a physical gravity to it. The recorder was small, and her eyes were bigger than the device as she slid it toward Detective Monroe. "I shouldn't have this," she said, voice low enough to keep the plates from clinking, but loud enough for the small group, Maya, Greta, Detective Monroe, to hear. But I couldn't live with what I heard. She had been near the study door on the night everything went wrong. The recording she had taken was a fragment, a thing of breath and broken sentences. On it, a woman's voice, sharp, precise, and not given to error, said words that suggested a deliberate plan. If she can't be kept, place her where someone will find her. Make it look like an accident. The voice was Vanessa, or at least it was close enough for a human ear to recognize. The recorder's edges were rough. The audio had been clipped and then muffled, but there was a cadence that matched the memory Otis had described. Camila's confession was the kind of moral pivot that makes truths tip out of balance. She had been loyal until loyalty became a trap.
Detective Monroe held the recorder between two fingers like a fragile relief. "We have to authenticate this," she said. "We can't present it in court without verification." "Then verify it," Greta said for all of them. Her voice carried the steady, unentitled insistence of someone who had been overlooked so often she had turned it into muscle. "If this is what it sounds like, then it's what it sounds like." The thing about evidence is that it requires a chain. It needs someone to hold it, to pass it without contamination, to mark its time. Darnell's footage needed to be copied, cataloged, and its origins explained. The audio needed a forensic marker. People who had been invisible their whole lives learned that the apparatus designed to protect the powerful could also be used, slowly, awkwardly, to hold them accountable. Pressure rose. The Harper PR machine, sensing the angle of reputational damage, released a statement that was careful in its cruelty. The family was devastated by the incident and confident the truth would be revealed. It is a kind of confidence that presumes truth is something you can buy. The city's feed split along lines that followed class and race like mapping lines. Opinion pieces asked about parenting and poverty, and whether workers on the estate should be presumed innocent until proven guilty, or presumed a problem until proven clean. Through it all, Maya held the baby, who was unnamed at least to them in those early days, in the small, guarded privacy of Greta's apartment. She fed her with fingers she learned to soften into spoon-like steadiness. She hummed the prayers she had in her head, short, private things, "Lord, help her," and "thank you," words that were closer to habit than a theology. When the baby slept, Maya sat and watched the rise and fall of the child's chest, and thought of urgent, careful things: a name, some clothes, a place to keep a child that would not fear the night. There were nights Maya could not sleep at all. She replayed the alley's sequence in her mind and tortured herself with what-ifs. If she had done something different, the baby might have been found without all of this. If she had not climbed into the dumpster, someone else might have stepped into the story and the narrative might have been kinder. The guilt of survival is a private, exacting companion. Detective Monroe moved, as detectives must, with a kind of sober choreography. She went to Darnell and said plainly that if what he had was true, it could change the way the whole house looked. She asked Camila to hand over her audio, to let it be forensically tested. She took Otis's statement and wrote down the precise times, but she also warned them against the most dangerous thing, publicizing raw material before it had been verified. "If any of this leaks prematurely and is discredited," she said, "it will make it harder to prove the truth."
Maya watched them do that work and felt both relief and the old, deep loneliness of someone who had been made small. She wanted to shout that she had done nothing wrong. She wanted to hug the baby until the world understood. Instead, she learned to be patient in a way that was not resignation, but a hard-edged readiness. When Detective Monroe said they might recommend charges for obstruction or for removal of a child if evidence suggested an inside job, Maya could only watch the mechanics of law like something in the distance that might or might not save her. In the background, there were small, human things that kept the larger narrative tethered to life. Greta sewed a tiny pink bonnet because the baby's scalp needed cover. Darnell stayed in the laundry room until his coffee went cold because he'd started something he could not unsee. Otis walked behind the hedge at noon and looked at the spots where footprints might still live. And Camila, who had once been the machine's oil, began to show cracks in public poise, little moments when she would flinch at a name or when she would close herself behind a phone call. As the small coalition took shape, Maya, Greta, Detective Monroe, Darnell, Otis and the trembling, morally redeeming figure of Camila, so did a news story thread. It was a story about how visible people could be weaponized by wealth, and how the invisible, when they decided to be witnesses, could become dangerous in a way powerful people feared. Maya's role was not passive. She became the pivot of a new lineup, a tenant, a rescuer, a mother by necessity more than by title. She began to understand that her act of pulling a child from a dumpster would require more than endurance. It would require a small army of ordinary people prepared to keep the record true. There were moments of small tenderness that cut through the tension like light through a narrow window. Once, Maya took the baby to a thrift store where a woman gave her a used baby bonnet in exchange for a story about the woman whose child had been left in a dumpster. The woman's eyes were soft in the way people's eyes are when they know the world may have taken more from a person than it has given. "You gave her breath," she said simply. "That's everything." It was a line Maya repeated to herself 24 times until it became true in the way a stitch becomes a seam. She had given that child breath. That fact was not, could not be negotiable. The rest of it, the legalities, the accusations, the way power moved to protect itself, was history in the making. Just when Darnell's footage seemed like a fragile keystone, Detective Monroe received a call from a voice she knew as solid, the ADA, Joel Bennett. He was pragmatic, the kind of man who had spent years in courtrooms watching hearts and careers counted like coins. "This is high stakes," he said into Monroe's line the first time they spoke.
If the House has tampered with footage, and if there is audio that suggests an internal decision, we can move, but we need to be careful. Careful in this case meant passing proof through a chain of custody so meticulous it bordered on ritual. They copied the thumb drives in the precinct's secure room, signed for them like medieval relics, and locked them into a safe. They routed the audio to an outside lab for voice authentication. They interviewed Otis with a sensitivity that bordered on reverence, drawing out the small details that gave his account texture. When Camila sat in a small interview room and confirmed the voice on the audio, her hands were slick with sweat, and her voice was a tiny animal. "I heard her say it," she whispered. "I thought if I didn't tell someone, it would keep happening." None of it was fast. The wheels of justice are not quick. They are a kind of patient violence that grinds facts into something presentable under oath. But each copy of evidence, each confirmation that the audio's waveform matched Vanessa Harper's known speech patterns, each witness who could place a figure at a time and place, it all began to press on an outline of a truth that might be proven. And yet, as the coalition braced itself, a darker hum entered the world. The Harper PR team, sensing pressure, began an offensive. They cultivated sympathies by leaking small angles, how grief can make a family lurch toward the most obvious scapegoat, how a missing child can create fear that seeks an explanation, how a staff member, unaccounted for at a key moment, must be responsible. The feeds filled with contrasting stories, one that suggested a heartless maid, and another that suggested a calculated cover-up. For Maya, the public story was a weather system. At night, when the baby slept against her chest and Greta's little stove clicked in the next room like a lighthouse, she would open a phone and see strangers weigh in on her life. Some called her saint or savior in one breath and thief in the next. Others offered prayers and donations. The buffet of public opinion provided cheap absolution to some and cheap damnation to others. Detective Monroe's voice remained a tether. "Evidence wins cases," she told Maya in one quiet hour. "The rest is noise." Maya wanted to believe it like a prayer. Then, one evening, Darnell sent a text, "Meet me, now." He gave an address, a cramped storage unit at the edge of town. When Maya arrived, the door slid up, and Darnell lifted one small taped box like he was carrying a sleeping child. "I kept more," he said. "I found a copy of a hard drive. I don't know why it was there, but it was. I think someone on night duty made a copy and stashed it." They put the drive into the precinct's secure hands and watched the footage again. This time the image resolved enough to show a shadow of a face, a flash, a profile seen for the breadth of a frame. It wasn't definitive, but it insisted on being looked at.
Maya's stomach dropped when she saw the profile. There was a spark of recognition that felt like a burn. It could be 100 things, an angle, a trick of light, but the image carried a presence. Camila called shortly after, her voice a thin, see-through thing. "I can bring you more," she said. "I have an audio file on a backup phone. I can't keep it at the house." Detective Monroe arranged a meeting at a neutral place. Camila arrived with a bag that contained the recorder and a look that told them she had chosen who she would be.
She had been Vanessa's assistant. Her loyalties had shifted. As they listened to the file in the precinct's better-sounding interview room, the room filled with the crawl of static. Then a voice, clearer now than the first time, said in a soft, clipped tone, "We can't keep her. No one will know if we place her where someone will find her. Make it look like an accident." Maya felt the world tilt. Her hands, which had been steady for weeks, trembled. She had saved a life. She had given that child breath. If this was what it sounded like, then it was an accusation not of a nameless maid, but of a choice that could be traced back to a person who moved through rooms with privilege like it was oxygen. Detective Monroe kept her face carefully unreadable. "We need to verify the voice print," she said. "But if this is authentic, you've done the brave thing by coming forward, Camila." Camila pressed both her hands flat on the metal table. "I can't say I'm not scared," she admitted, "but I heard her say it. I heard her tell someone to place the baby. She didn't mean for anyone to know." "Then we corroborate," Monroe said. "We get Darnell's footage authenticated. We compare the audio. We find out who was on duty and whether anyone else saw something. We do not release raw material. We hold it tight." Maya thought of the baby, tiny and steady in Greta's arms, and felt the bright, ice-hard rage that lives in people who have been trampled upon unjustly. She remembered that look Thomas Harper had given her in the alley, a look that said he could erase you with a gesture. Now there was a fragile and dangerous possibility, a truth that, if verified, would flip expectations. But truth in a world like theirs moves like a slow tide, patient, determined, and capable of drowning the careless. There would be counterattacks. The estate would hire lawyers. They would dig for anything that made Maya look less credible, a gap in her past, a misremembered detail, a history they could present as motive. The press would feast on the friction. The Harper arsenal included money, reputation, and an appetite for preserving the family narrative. That night, as Maya walked home with the baby swaddled beneath the old jacket her sister had sent from the other end of the country, she felt a new heat by her skin. Fear, yes, but also the bright thing that follows a hand held to a live future. She knew the stakes. If this audio and this footage were authenticated, something like justice might be in reach. If they were discredited or buried, her name would be the cauterized wound the rich used to cover their footprints. She held the baby tighter, as if the small pressure at the base of the skull could anchor fate. Greta made a bed for the child in her tiny bedroom and hummed a tune Maya did not recognize. The city outside their window was a yellow smear of taxi lights and the occasional late siren. On the table, her phone lit with incoming notifications, messages from people offering housing help, threats from anonymous accounts, the polite inquiries of journalists. The baby slept like a small promise. Maya found herself returning to the alley in her mind. She remembered the slick cold of the blanket, the way the dumpster lid had scraped against her palm. She remembered the smallness of the baby's hand closing on her finger as if to say, "Don't let me go." She did not feel like a saint. She felt like a woman who had done what any human being would do when faced with a living thing in danger. It was that simple and that radical. A week after Camila's confession, a procedural step arrived that felt like a bridge. Detective Monroe had filed for permission to run the voice through an outside lab and to submit Darnell's footage for independent analysis. The ADA, Joel Bennett, said they had the outlines of something, a missing segment of the estate's footage, a shadow on a copied drive, a voice captured in a hurried confession. He warned them that the Harper legal team would be aggressive. "They will try to isolate you, to make you look unreliable," he said. "We counter with patience. Evidence, well documented, will go a long way." Maya listened, and in the gray hours when sleep thinned and fear sharpened like a blade, she whispered to the baby, "You don't owe them anything. You only owe yourself a life." The baby kicked and turned in her arms, small and stubborn as a promise. When she closed her eyes, she could almost see the alley again, not as a place of danger, but as the point where her life pivoted into an unexpected purpose. Outside, the feed still churned. The estate statement repeated in sleek form, but it could not stop a rumor from forming. What if the missing child had not been abandoned, but placed, deliberately, where someone would find her? What if the act that made Maya a suspect was an act of protection by someone inside the house? For every person who wanted a quick answer, there were 3 who wanted to see it unfold fully before they passed judgment. Before dawn the next day, Maya received a quiet text from Darnell. "There's another clip. Meet me at the laundromat." He attached a photograph, a frame from the drive that looked at first glance empty. Then, almost as an afterimage, a flash of a bracelet, thin, gold, with a small engraving. The bracelet, thin and gleaming despite the dirt, with a tiny engraving that caught the light in the photo like an accusation. VH, the tag read, the letters cramped as if carved in a rush. Maya held the image with a kind of holy caution. For a moment she could not breathe around it. The photo was a small, bright thing that made everything else recede. Greta watched her from the stove where she stirred a pot of soup, the steam making her glasses halo. "If that's the same bracelet," Greta said, "then there's a thread to pull." They took the thread and began to wind it. Detective Monroe called a meeting that afternoon in a precinct room that smelled faintly of coffee and used paper. Darnell sat with his hands folded, still the same man who looked like he could fix anything but the way power worked. He handed over another thumb drive, one he'd kept hidden in a boot, in his car, in the one place he had thought no one would think to look. "I didn't want to trust anyone at the house with it," he said. "I put copies and spread them a little, just in case." Monroe thanked him and looked at the drive as if it were a living creature. It went into the chain of custody and later into a machine that hummed with the quiet authority of bureaucracy. The footage that came back was grainy and half at the edge of recognition, but there, between two frames of a slow-moving, well-lit corridor, was the briefest flash of metal at a wrist. The angle shifted and the face blurred. It was not enough to pronounce identity beyond reasonable doubt. But the bracelet matched the close-up in Darnell's photo, and filmmakers of Scandal would call the match a motif, a visual repetition that implicates. Camilla came by the precinct the next day with a new confession tucked into the soft tissues of her voice. She had sat through the house's polite functions for years, taking notes on other people's grief, carrying umbrellas for storms she did not choose. Now, when she spoke, it was with a clarity that felt worn and true. "The bracelet. Vanessa wore it all the time," she said. "It was small and thin. She kept it in the study on a tray with her keys and a lighter. I used to think it was a habit. Leave it there. Pick it up. After you showed me the audio, I went to see if I could remember when I last saw it. I realized it was gone the morning after the party." Monroe wrote that down and then looked up at Maya. "We'll try to match the engraving," she said. "We'll get the bracelet itself if it exists. We'll ask the estate to produce jewelry inventories under subpoena. We'll cross-reference delivery records. It's going to be messy. Expect them to fight every piece." They were right about the fighting. The Harper legal team moved like a practice storm.
Their lead counsel filed motions that sought to bury Darnell's drives as illegally obtained. They filed privacy claims around Camilla's testimony, and they pushed for delayed release of evidence on grounds of protecting a grieving family. Their public posture was grief shaded by legal vocabulary, a deliberate form of pall that made argument look like sympathy. At the same time, an undercurrent of pressure swelled outside courts and rooms. Anonymous messages came for Darnell, curated to unsettle. Questions about his employment, rumors about his character. Otis, the gardener, found strange cars by the hedge when he arrived to check the greenhouse. Camilla received a polite note from the Harper house manager warning her of confidentiality obligations. The note read like a threat written in proper stationery. But the small coalition had learned to brace. Monroe moved with the kind of quiet that seeks to choke off panic. "Document everything," she said. "If they try to intimidate anyone, we record it. If anyone approaches Darnell, write it down and tell me immediately. We're going to show the chain is intact." The first breakthrough arrived not in a courtroom, but in a back room at a pawn shop. A woman who dealt in estate jewelry had a thin gold bracelet come in the week after the party, sold by a woman who said she'd found it in an alley. The seller had left no name, only a phone number that traced to a burner. The pawn records were a small, greasy map. The bracelet changed hands quickly, then apparently vanished. Monroe obtained the records and, through methodical subpoenas, drew a line between the bracelet and a courier used by the Harper office, someone who handled errands and small deliveries. They followed the courier until the line frayed and led to a rental locker, where a box sat like an honest thing. Inside was the missing bracelet, wrapped in the corner of a silk scarf. The engraving, VH, was clear and bright. For the team that had taken to seeing absence, it was a kind of manifesto. Someone had meant the jewelry to be detached from its owner. Monroe felt a little of the old law work settle into relief. "We can place the bracelet in Vanessa's possession prior to the night," she told ADA Joel Bennett. "We can show it was in the house, and we can show it ended up in the alley after the party." Bennett, pragmatic in the way people who stand in courtrooms must be, nodded. "We'll use records, staff testimony, and the physical evidence to establish a timeline. The audio will require authentication, but if the lab confirms it and the witnesses corroborate, we can present a coherent narrative to a grand jury." Then came the lab results. The voice analysis returned with a match rate that internal reports described as significantly consistent with Vanessa Harper's known speech patterns. The lab report, careful and studious, became the kind of document that is not dramatic by itself, but which, when placed in the hands of a prosecutor, can become a very precise kind of pressure.
That pressure was applied. Arrest warrants followed the patterns of methodical pursuit. Vanessa Harper was taken in for questioning. She sat in a room with soft walls and the look of someone who had been trained to stay several moves ahead. Her answers were measured. At first, she denied wrongdoing and dismissed the audio as manipulated. When confronted with the bracelet, she relaxed her fingers around the armrest and said, in a voice that was oddly empty, that she could not explain how the bracelet had left her study. The public had a taste for melodrama, and it obliged. Cameras circled the courthouse like birds. Reporters called numbers, and texts flew. People lined social feeds into predictable lanes, the wealthy family's sorrow against the desperate narrative of a maid turned criminal. In the middle of this theater, a quieter work persisted: paperwork, chain of custody notes, witness prep, pre-trial motions. Maya sat in on some of these sessions, listening to the technicalities with a patience she had not known she possessed. She had a new vocabulary now, a knowledge of what a subpoena meant, what a certification from an outside lab looked like, what kinds of motions a defense team would use to attack witnesses. She learned the procedural rhythms with the same steady hand she had once used to fold bed linens. The Harper team, predictably, went for credibility. They painted Maya as unreliable, a woman with gaps in employment, a tendency toward embellished memory, they suggested. They looked for contradictions, as any defense does, but the coalition had built a scaffolding of proof. Darnell's footage produced frames that matched the times Otis had given. Camila's testimony about hearing Vanessa's words in the study aligned with the audio. The bracelet had been traced back to the house. Forensic experts affirmed that the recording had not been doctored in any obvious way, and that the voice was highly likely to be Vanessa's. There were dark yards of effort to make this hold. Monroe and Bennett prepared each witness like someone assembling a delicate instrument. Maya practiced telling the truth without spilling into anger. She learned to breathe steadier at the edges of questions. Otis practiced describing a smell without performing shock. Darnell rehearsed where he had hidden copies and why he had kept them. Camila rehearsed the facts she could swear to, and the fear she had felt inside the house that made her finally speak. Each rehearsal was a thin strip of armor. Cross-examination is a place where truth is hammered into shape. The defense was ferocious in limiting context, in suggesting mistake, in implying that the public wanted simplicity out of a complex tangle.
They called character witnesses for the Harpers, who could testify to their benevolence, to their grief, to their inability, perhaps, to do wrong. They used tone as a shield. They implied that the estate, like a cathedral of decorum, could not house wickedness. But truth is not only the brittle sound of an accused wall of self-preservation. It is also the quiet ring of ordinary people remembering what they saw. At the preliminary hearing, Otis walked to the stand with the humility of a man whose life was counted in seasons and soil. He described the drag of a sleeve, the way the hem had brushed the gravel, the timestamp on a memory he had not realized would be used as a legal hinge. His voice did not tremble. It simply told the story as one would describe a prodigal season. Camila testified with the color of someone who had left a life for the sake of truth. She told the court she had recorded the conversation because she felt she might forget the shape of Vanessa's voice. "I thought I could will it from memory," she said, "but it stayed in my head. I could not carry it anymore." The audio was played. The courtroom leaned forward as if into a confession. The clip was brief. Words said in an offhand tone, the kind of domestic cruelty that sounds almost pragmatic in a house long accustomed to solving problems with other people's hands.
But the jury saw, through the measured testimony of Monroe and Bennett, through the corroborating frames, through Camila's audio and the bracelet that linked an image to a house, a narrative larger than cynicism. They saw a woman who had acted, and an apparatus that had, perhaps, tried to erase accountability by turning the rescuer into a suspect. Outside the courthouse, Thomas Harper stood on the steps with his hands in his pockets. He had changed in the slow, brittle way of people who had been forced to watch what was hidden in their world come into the light. He had watched his wife's denial, and then the footage and the audio. He had had to choose between the family story he had believed in and the evidence that suggested a deliberate action. Privilege does not always blind. Sometimes it narrows vision into a tunnel where shame is dimmer than truth. In a moment that surprised no one and yet felt like an admission, Thomas sought out Maya. They did not meet as equals that afternoon. There was still distance and something like pain in Thomas's face. "I wasn't here," he said. "I was told that my wife was replacing what was lost. I believed a story that fit the house's rhythm and not the children's needs. I am sorry." He did not ask for forgiveness like a demand. He offered it like a thing he had learned to hold. Maya listened. She had 1,000 reasons to be furious. She also had the baby against her chest, a small body that had known only survival and human hands.
"I saved her," she said, not like a boast, but like a fact that needed no commentary. Thomas, awkward with ways of smallness, placed a hand tentatively on the edge of Greta's sofa where Maya sat. He asked what he could do to ensure the baby's safety. It was a question that began to form a new kind of future. Arrest came before the trial concluded. Vanessa Harper was taken into custody on charges that included child endangerment and obstruction related to the deliberate placement of the infant. She maintained, through counsel, that she had not intended harm. The audio suggested otherwise, and the bracelet, the timestamps, and the corroborating witness accounts closed a circle of evidence that made prosecution reasonable and the community watchful. Trials are weird public things, part law, part theater, part communal ritual in which a society might test its own conscience. In the courtroom, the defense tried to paint a picture of a household in crisis, how grief could make people break, and how a misinterpreted decision could be seen as malicious. They argued about motive and about the house's internal chaos. ADA Bennett, with a voice that was less showman than technician, laid out the chain: the missing footage, the extra copy found by Darnell, Camila's audio, Otis's witness of movement towards the alley at a specific hour, the bracelet's provenance. He did not raise his voice to beautiful effect, he raised it to make a pattern of ordinary facts readable.
When the jury returned with a verdict, the courtroom held its collective breath like a fragile thing that anticipated either shattering or release. The word guilty landed not like a triumph, but like a legal hinge closing after a long, slow pressure. There was no melodramatic weeping or celebratory applause. There were faces, Thomas, Maya, Greta, Detective Monroe, ADA Bennett, that registered relief and wariness. The legal system had done what it could with the material it had been giving. It had found someone responsible and allowed the machinery of accountability to take a step. Sentencing details were indefinite, in the sense that the specifics of punishments and durations were not the story's center. What followed was a human rearrangement: Vanessa taken away, the household forced into new patterns, Thomas looking at his home as if through a pane of glass he had never noticed was fogged. In the weeks after the verdict, the quieter work of restoration began. Court proceedings established temporary guardianship arrangements for the baby. Thomas Harper, confronted by evidence and his own choices, proposed a plan. He would accept co-guardianship with Maya for the child, providing the security and resources necessary for the baby's well-being without attempting to erase Maya's role. It was a fraught and imperfect thing, an offer of reparation mixed with paternal instinct. But for Maya, whose life had been a series of small inheritances of care and work, it felt like a possible doorway. Greta sat at the edge of Maya's decision, knitting fingers that had always known how to hold what other people discarded and turn it into warmth. "You saved her," she reminded Maya one evening, as they sat in the kitchen with the baby on a soft blanket between them. The statement, simple and true, carried weight. Maya thought hard about power and the ways it could shape a person's life. She thought about being seen as a suspect, and then being seen enough to be believed. She thought about the child who had known only the sharp edges of night, and who would, with luck, know hands that sang. She said yes to the co-guardianship, not because she wanted a title, but because she wanted safety and constancy for the baby. It was practical and tender at once. The temporary legal arrangements were filed, and the court approved a plan that ensured the child would remain with Greta's household for the immediate future, with formal oversight and the promise of regular review. Months later, after paperwork and hearings and careful court reviews, the matter of permanent guardianship came before a judge. In the courtroom, Maya's life, textured by years of small work and sudden media exposure, was represented in a mosaic of witness statements, character references, and a record of her devotion to the child. Thomas Harper's testimony was not grand in rhetoric, it was an acknowledgement. "Maya has a fidelity to the child that is unmistakable," he told the courtroom.
"My family has failed in a profound way. I want to repair that failure where I can." The judge, after considering the evidence and the welfare reports, signed an order granting Maya full guardianship, with Thomas's support and regular visitation rights for the child. The order did not erase hard days or the pain inflicted. It simply established a legal future where Maya's role was recognized and protected. That afternoon, when the papers were final, Greta made tea so strong it tasted like iron, and Maya sat on the stoop of the tiny apartment and held the baby in her lap. People from the community had left flowers at the door and small notes, some apologies, some prayers. Darnell stopped by with a thermos for Maya and the offhand joke that he had brought stronger coffee than any lawyer's arguments. Otis placed a small pot of herbs on the windowsill. Camila, who had returned to something like work, brought a hand-stitched blanket she had made, because she wanted to leave behind something that was not the texture of a recorded confession. They held a naming ceremony in Greta's cramped living room that evening. It was not formal. There were no reporters, no cameras, just friends and allies and a few journalists who had been invited and asked to stay away from the intimate parts. Maya thought about names for days. Names are small claim markers in a world that often seeks to take things away. She wanted a name with both roots and an aperture for future. They decided together, with Thomas's unexpected blessing and Greta's approval, Ella Williams Harper. Ella for the smallness that had clung to life in a dumpster and then to the warmth of a jacket. Williams to honor the line Maya carried and the fierce, unpolished dignity of her family. Harper because the legal and social realities turned her into a child with two lives converging, one of wealth and consequence, one of hands that had washed dishes and carried pillows, and that night in the alley had given breath. The ceremony was unspectacular, and because of that, perfect. Someone read a poem about small things surviving storms. Someone else made tea and gave toasts in low voices. Maya whispered a prayer the way she always did in private. Lord, keep her. It was not an argument with fate. It was a request wrapped in the habits of a life that had known how to ask. Afterward, the news cycle quieted. Not all the world learned to hold its attention for long. Scandal burns bright and fades. But the community that had banded for Maya stayed. They formed a small board, informal at first, and began to sketch what would become the Ella Initiative, a grassroots program aimed at helping parents on the margins secure temporary housing, legal resources, and the kinds of small care that prevent tragedies. The initiative would not be a grand charity at first. It would start as a few rented rooms and a hotline and the energy of people who had been shown the cost of invisibility.
They launched it quietly, with Greta managing the first calls and Maya sitting at meetings where she learned to translate anger into policy. Darnell handled logistics and drove a van to pick up donations. Otis offered gardens where families could learn to grow food. Camilla helped with paperwork, her pen steady now in ways it had not been when she took notes for her employer. Thomas Harper made a donation that, while substantial, came with strings that were negotiated and then gently removed. The money was given with no conditions. It was a kind of reparation that made wealth usable without ownership. Months turned into a slow montage of recovery. Maya found work in the initiative, eventually becoming its program director, the person who could translate a lived experience into structural change. She learned grant writing, which felt like learning a new language, and she learned how to speak in front of small groups without the nervousness that journalism had once made her feel. The baby, Ella, grew in the center of it all, carried like a small sun that everyone seemed to orbit. She learned to sit, then crawl, then walk in steps that were quick and determined, like someone eager to make their own way. Thomas and Maya learned to move past the original antagonism into a strange, respectful truce. He came to visits with a bag of carefully chosen fruits and a tentative smile. He helped fund daycare spaces, and when the community needed it, a scholarship fund for children whose parents had been displaced by scandal. He did not become a perfect man. He simply showed, in the ways he could, that accountability could be a path to some kind of repair. There were painful echoes, too. Vanessa's name did not disappear. Some nights Maya woke to articles and comment threads that tried to simplify everything into a moral cartoon. People argued online about who had the right to raise a child, and about how wealth and guilt should be balanced. Maya stepped back from public argument whenever she could. The work of reconstructing a child's life was not served by shouting at strangers. She learned to use public voice sparingly, to speak when it served the child. The initiative slowly gained traction. Neighborhoods offered meeting spaces. A local pediatrician volunteered to do free checkups. A retired paralegal started a clinic offering pro bono help for custody hearings. Maya was not the only person who had learned from the scandal. Others had been changed too, and their choices built a network that started to feel like a system. One evening, on the anniversary of the night she found Ella, Maya walked the route behind Harper Estate with Otis at her side. The alley smelled different now. The dumpsters had been upgraded, the lights repositioned, and the hedge trimmed with care. They walked in silence for part of it, watching a small street cat hunt for its dinner like it had always done. You know, Otis said, I worried that stepping forward would ruin me.
But it didn't. It did the opposite. It gave me a place again. Maya thought about invisibility and visibility, how a single act could make a person seen, and how many small acts were required to keep that visibility from being used to harm. She thought about the baby's fist closing on her hand, and how that had been a kind of contract. I will hold you. You will live. She hummed the tune Greta had hummed that first week, and felt the same small brightness she had felt when she first warmed the infant's chest. Years later, When Ella was old enough to understand pieces of her story, Maya called her in the spare way she had learned was best. Facts, not fanfare. Explanation without blame. "You were found when the sky was thin and the world was loud," Maya said once as they sat on a stoop and the sunset made the bricks gold. "Someone left you where I could find you. I kept you. That is what I did." Ella looked at her with a face that had the exact stubbornness of a person who had survived an early, sharp thing and then refused to let it define them. She reached for Maya's hand, and they held it like two people who had rewritten the map of a life to include each other. There were memorials of a different kind. Vanessa's conviction remained a note in the public record, but it did not animate daily life. The initiative grew into an organization that helped hundreds of families with small interventions that often prevented catastrophe. Maya's name became known in certain circles as a person who had acted and then built a system out of the evidence of action. She did not seek headlines. She responded to need. Her work with the initiative led to community gatherings where parents could trade clothes and share a warm meal. The project was small and stubborn and useful. She kept a photograph of the bracelet in a drawer, a reminder of how small items could change narratives. Sometimes she would take it out and trace the engraving with her thumb, not for proof, but to remember the net of choices that had caught a child and pulled her into a life. She kept another picture, one of her with Ella on Greta's sofa the night they named her, a messy image where a lamp haloed the small face and the edges were not clean. It was a picture that told truth more than a press release ever could. On quiet Sundays, Maya went to the park with Ella and watched her run toward the swings. Parents congregated and swapped recipes and tips about teething in schools. Some of them had stories like hers, others had none. The past remained present in small ways, a conversation that scraped at memory, a journalist who called sometimes, but it did not determine the shape of ordinary days. Once, years after the alley and the hearings, Thomas Harper came by with a quiet envelope and a small note. He had learned some lessons about humility and about the cost of assuming the world was a place he could tidy by decree. He had also learned how much a person could be changed by being seen to be wrong.
He left a donation to fund a scholarship in Ella's name, a small trust to help kids from similar circumstances get an early education. He asked for nothing in return. Maya accepted it, and as she did, felt the weird, complicated satisfaction of a woman who had made sure a child had life enough to name her future. She kept no illusions that the world had become fair. She knew it had not. She also knew what rubble of small help could be used to build a shelter that lasted. The late afternoon light on the day Ella started school pooled in the doorway like something grateful. Maya walked beside her and watched the small body move into a classroom where a woman greeted children by name. The teachers knew Ella's story in outline, but treated her like any other child, sometimes a mercy in itself. As the door closed, Maya put a hand on the vibrant strap of the backpack and said the line she had started to say to herself since that night. "You don't owe them anything. You only owe yourself a life." Ella looked back at her and smiled, a flash of teeth that made Maya's throat ache in the way that joy can be almost painful. "I saved her," Maya would sometimes whisper in memory, not as a claim, but as a fact she had carried so steadily it had become part of her bones. That truth had been enough to start a chain that led to courtroom testimony and a conviction, and then to a different collection of acts: guardianship, community organizing, a nonprofit born out of outrage and tenderness. The story that began in a dumpster ended not with a tidy moral, but with an ongoing life. There was justice in the legal sense. Vanessa had been held accountable. There was restoration in the personal, a child given a name and a future. And there was a redefinition of family, chosen guardianship, community support, and a web of people who refused to let the child be invisible. On warm evenings, families from the initiative gathered in a small municipal lot that had been converted into a community garden. Children chased one another through beds of kale, elders sat on folding chairs telling stories, volunteers offered to mend clothes and to drive neighbors to appointments. Maya moved through it like someone who had found her task, her hands busy, her voice used to brief instruction, her laughter easy. Ella, a child who once fit in the cupped shelter of a jacket, ran among them like a small comet, leaving bright trails. The last image in the story, if there needs to be one, is ordinary. Maya kneeling on loamy soil, a small trowel in her hand, Ella beside her with dirt under her nails. They planted basil in a row. The basil smelled like summer and steady work.
Maya thought about the dumpster in the cold, about the small hand that had wrapped around hers that night, and the way that grip had set the course of everything.
She thought of Greta's kindness, of Darnell's quiet courage, of Otis's steady gaze, of Camila's difficult honesty, of Detective Monroe and ADA Bennett's patient legal craft, and of Thomas Harper's awkward attempt at repair. They were all pieces of a tapestry stitched from scandal and reparation, from accusation and truth. Maya planted the basil and whispered, in the way that people sometimes do when their life has been carved into before and after, "You're safe." Ella, who had absorbed too many stories already, dug with both hands and looked up at her guardian. "I know," she said, not as an adult, but as the small person who had survived a night and then learned to live. Her voice was a small truth that made everything else possible. If you are moved by what happened to Maya and Ella and want to learn more about how communities can protect children and vulnerable parents, you can visit the initiatives page to find resources and ways to help. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that one person's courage can ripple into many lives.